We live in a golden age of cult awareness. We really are at a tipping point and things are really changing. The public are ready. Anti-trafficking laws are being used to great effect to put away some destructive cult leaders and high control leaders. Coercive control has been a crime for the last more than 10 years. Why is it not working? These are all the countries or jurisdictions in the world where coercive control is now a criminal offense. So things are slowly moving, There is a sea change of law taking place at the national level. The next step will be to expand coercive control laws to apply to groups. At the moment, coercive control laws, they only apply to individuals, family relationships or intimate relationships. Okay, undue influence. This has traditionally been narrowly applied to wills and trusts, but even this is changing. It is applying more. California in 2014 passed a new law on undue influence, describing it as excessive persuasion and evidence of the authority may include a spiritual advisor. So even undue influence is not an immutable object. There is change taking place. And more recently, there's been a proposal to criminalize predatory alienation in New Jersey, which is ongoing. But all this change is taking place at the national level. There is a sea change, but nothing is happening at the international level. So this is what I'm going to talk about, a human right to the freedom of mind. Okay, what is the freedom of mind? In the literature, it's described, in especially Buddhist writings, it's described as freedom from the mind itself, freedom from the raw processes. It's described as imagination, creativity, the freedom to think freely, the liberty to think without external restriction. It's freedom in the mental health system, freedom to refuse medical restraints, freedom to refuse medical treatment. It's also known as cognitive liberty, the freedom to enhance your mind using neurotechnology, transcranial stimulation, and other types of neurological enhancements. And what is freedom of mind? It's related to the cult word, why we're all here. And this is how I first got interested in it. So it emerges in the literature, the author of Freedom of Mind, who's here right now, and also in other texts as well. Okay, so every single human right has positive and negative freedoms. Human rights don't just define themselves on what they are for, they define themselves what they are against, for and against. All these things, some of these are crimes already: coercive control, undue influence or civil tort, predatory alienation. But freedom of mind cannot define itself on what it's against. It has to define itself on what it's for. I speak as someone with a partial background in law. More law is not the answer. More incarceration is not the answer. As much as I support criminalizing coercive control, it doesn't get to the root cause. We have to deal with the root cause, not the condition. So you have the positive freedoms, the freedom to think, access information, believe, individuate into an adult. Okay, so human rights have a foundational hierarchy to them. Rights permit other rights. What use is the freedom of speech if you do not have freedom of thought? And also, what use is freedom of thought if you do not have freedom of mind? This is the missing piece in the international human rights system. At no point in international human rights text is freedom of mind referred to explicitly. It's there implicitly, but not explicitly. And this is what has to change. Where do we go from here and what awaits us? International law exists in various categories. You have declarations which are not legally binding. You have customary law and international treaties which have full legal force. If we look at the historical development of human rights, you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, not legally binding, it has no legal force. This was followed subsequently by subsequent covenants, conventions that do have this legal force, that are negotiated between state parties, between governments. This is the path that freedom of mind will follow as a human right. First, you have the declaration that will be submitted to the United Nations General Assembly and ratified. Again, no legal force. However, the covenant will have legal force, and this is what must follow. Okay, so my colleague Bandy Lee, who edited The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, she's authored this declaration. This is the Declaration of Freedom of Mind. You can access it on the World Mental Health Coalition website. For the first time in history, we have freedom of mind in written form, articulated in a text and available. And this can act as the basis for any declaration that is submitted to the UN. Okay, so back in '92, Alan Shefflin, law professor, wrote this article calling for freedom of mind as a human right. He writes, stronger, more explicit protection for the mind must be written into international human rights documents. The task will not be an easy one. International consensus will have to be obtained on such issues as to what constitutes freedom of mind. So the world must come to a consensus about what is freedom of mind, and crucially, what is the legitimate scope and what are the limits of freedom of mind. Okay, so cognitive liberty theorists, they're arguing for a different type of freedom of mind. They're arguing for the freedom to enhance your mind through neurotechnology. This is very different to what's written in the Declaration, which is all about education. So this is just one instance where consensus will have to be reached on what is the scope of freedom of mind. Is it education, or is it enhancing your mind through neurotechnology and other drugs? There are 6 official languages in the United Nations. Every single human rights text must be translated into those 6 languages. Why is this important? Because meanings do not have the same meaning in different languages. You can see there in French, spirit, mind, and body. They do not translate exactly into French. This is not only a linguistical maelstrom, but it's also an opportunity for opponents of freedom of mind to water down the strength of the right. If you use different words, if you use different language, you can weaken concepts. Okay, again, is more law the answer? Yes and no, okay? Human rights work best with a solid foundation in society. People have to know what a human right is if they are to make a claim for that right. So when you search freedom of mind, you come up with the author of the Freedom of Mind book and individualism. Freedom of mind is not individualism, it's individuality, it's creativity. Individualism is selfishness, individuality is creativity and progress. This has to change. We need people to contribute to the Wikipedia page, create the page, and contribute to the discussion. Okay, there is an assumption among a lot of people, especially in the cult world, that the human spirit wants to be free. I will ask you to question that somewhat. Does the human spirit want to be free every time and always? I think the answer is a bit more ambiguous than many of us care to admit. Okay, so this is the first cult documentary I watched. Unlike many people in this room, I never had a cultic experience. So I'd like to show you a clip about the first cult documentary I watched and how I got interested in this topic and why is it relevant to this research. How can someone be so stupid to believe something? That was never what interested me. What interested me was how someone could get to a state where they could be so evil to do something. As Voltaire says, people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. So for me, what interested me was this process of redemption. How can someone do something, not how someone can believe something? And this question of why people do terrible things, why do they believe things? This cannot be answered with only politics. It can only be answered through psychology. I want these academic disciplines broken down. And I think my PhD idea will contribute to this. This is interdisciplinary research. To understand authoritarianism, we have to understand psychology. This is changing slightly. You have an academic discipline of psychology, a new TEDx talk, but things are moving slowly. What happens in a cultic transformation, okay? This is our understanding of it. If you look at the bottom 2 pictures, this is what happens in a cultic transformation. But the analogy of the cult self opens up for a far wider understanding of human behavior and human society. If you look at the false self covers itself and does not present itself. So as Oscar Wilde says, man is least himself when he talks in his own person. But if you give him a mask, He will tell you the truth. Okay. Erich Fromm speaks of the pseudo-self, that most people do not develop a self in society. The mind is not free because it's developed under the subjugation of societal rules. This is why people say cults are a microcosm of society, and why some people say that a culture is a cult writ large. Okay, cut through that. Okay, rational ignorance. There is a cost to knowledge. We wonder why people are resistant to changing, to opening their minds. Ignorance is rational when the costs of knowledge outweigh the benefits. No one wants to be lied to, but no one wants to admit they've been lied to. Okay. Benjamin Franklin says, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a temporary safety deserve neither. But this is not how most people think. Even here in the USA, this was not the choice made by people after 9/11. And if people are willing to sacrifice their physical safety, their physical freedom, they will be willing to sacrifice their psychological freedom too. I lived in China for 3 years, okay? And there is an assumption among people who are working on combating information control and censorship that only if you can get the information to the people, they will open their minds. Needless to say, this is a little bit simplistic and patronizing. So this groundbreaking study examined how web activity clusters together. And what they found was there's a clear unenforced containment of information. And there is no correlation between how open a society is and the degree of containment. In most societies, liberal and authoritarian, people don't care what foreigners are saying. They don't care what outsiders are saying. So is it access denied, or is it access not wanted in the first place? Why is this important? Because the greatest obstacle to freedom of mind, it's not from outside, it's from within. It's not within state power, it's from within ourselves. A human right to the freedom of mind. Why do we need that? There is a risk of expanding the human rights system too widely, kind of inflation of human rights. And some criteria have been created to guard against this risk of rights inflation. I'm going to show how a freedom of mind meets all these conditions and then some. Okay, so within the existing human rights system, the basic elements of freedom of mind are there. There is freedom, that humans are essentially free. There's personality, that you have the right to your own personhood. There's privacy. Thought, belief, and conscience. And your own right to mental health. There's a question whether these rights will stand up in the 21st century. Will the existing human rights system and rights defend the mind? Or will we need a new set of rights that will defend freedom of mind in the 21st century, given the new threats that face it? Okay. This is relevant to whether we need a declaration or a convention. The declaration reinforces existing rights. It has no legal force, but it builds on what followed. If the declaration is insufficient, we will need a convention with full legal force. Okay, so this is in China, in Shanghai, where I used to live. They are testing the brain activity as a gauge for concentration levels. So you can see the kid and the girl in the middle. She's apparently, ostensibly concentrating more. This information will be shared with the parents, with the school, and children are being punished for having a bad score. Yeah, it's not even accurate, but anyway, like if you just have the clips slightly off, you can get a bad score. So freedom of the drafters of our human rights and freedom of thought especially, they never envisaged this. They didn't envision this fundamental invasion into our psyches like this. Yeah. Okay, this is in Hong Kong. This placard here says 不要洗脑, which means no to brainwashing. In the UK, over 100,000 Hong Kongers have come to the UK in just a year. They're fleeing for their children, to protect their children from being indoctrinated in the schools. The same thing is happening in Turkey. Science and education are being stripped from the curriculum and replaced with religious studies. Okay. This is the new assault on the infant's mind. This is the new refugee exodus. But the human rights system does not cater for these refugees. I propose terming this as freedom from mental slavery. These refugees need a human rights discourse to understand what is happening to them. They understand the dangers posed to their children, but they don't have the rights discourse and the legal protections that they need to protect themselves. Why do we need it more than ever? Do not underestimate the challenge that the human rights system is facing in this century. Human rights have piggybacked on Western power for the last century. As Western power fades, it may take the human rights system with it. We can't just go on the defensive. We have to go on the offensive. Freedom of mind is our tool to do that. We can push back against rising authoritarianism, but we cannot do it without this missing piece in the human rights puzzle. Okay, last year, there was large-scale protests in China. And in the middle of these protests, someone translated the Byte model of mind control into Chinese. This shows that humanity is not too thin a community to base the universal right to be free. It's the widest community we have. And that is why freedom of mind is so important. Okay. Authoritarianism, it begins at home. It is part of the human condition, but it doesn't have to be, and it may not always be. If we can start at home, we start with one moral person, they will go on then to challenge even the most repressive and brutal of regimes. These are our heroes. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. We have to finish what they started. Thank you.